There's a single, unglamorous decision every self-made millionaire made before the first real dollar ever showed up, and it has almost nothing to do with talent, timing, or the family they were born into. For a long time I assumed it was luck. Some people get the break, some people don't, and that's just how it goes. Then I started looking closely at what actually happened in the weeks right before things changed for people who built real wealth out of nothing, and I kept running into the same short, almost embarrassing act, over and over, hiding in plain sight. Something so ordinary that most of the people who've done it don't even remember doing it. I'll show you exactly what that act is, and exactly how Napoleon Hill described it, decades before most of these people were even born. What I can tell you right now is this: it takes less time than reading this sentence, it costs nothing, and almost nobody actually does it, which is precisely why so few people ever get rich. If you've made it this far, it's because you're determined to have a life of success, so I invite you to subscribe to the channel, because every video will help you develop the mindset that attracts wealth, prosperity, and new opportunities every day. Let me tell you where this actually started, because it wasn't with millionaires at all. It started with two people I knew personally, years apart, who wanted almost exactly the same thing. Both worked in offices that didn't excite them. Both talked, more than once, about eventually doing something of their own, something that would finally let them stop trading 40 hours a week for a paycheck that vanished before the next one arrived. Same age range, similar income. Neither one had an inheritance waiting, a rich uncle, a lucky break sitting on the horizon. If you'd met them both at a dinner party, you wouldn't have been able to guess which one, 10 years later, would own something real, and which one would still be having the exact same conversation, almost word for word, a decade after I first heard it. One of them built it. The other one is, as far as I know, still talking about it. I used to think the difference had to be effort. It wasn't. The one who never got there worked hard, genuinely hard, longer hours some weeks than the one who succeeded. I used to think it had to be intelligence or some hidden advantage I wasn't seeing. It wasn't that either. If anything, the one who stayed exactly where he started was the sharper conversationalist of the two, quicker with numbers, better read, the kind of person you'd bet on in a room full of strangers. So I stopped looking at what they were doing, and I started listening, very carefully, to how they talked about the thing they said they wanted. And that's where it got strange. One of them would say, almost every time the subject came up, some version of the same sentence: "I really need to get serious about this. I really want to build something of my own someday." Warm words. Sincere, even. And completely empty of anything you could actually hold in your hand. No number. No date. No description specific enough that a stranger could have pictured it. Just a general, comfortable direction, aimed at nothing in particular, the kind of goal that can survive forever precisely because it never has to be tested against anything real. The other one, the one who actually built it, described her plan to me one afternoon with a level of detail that honestly caught me off guard the first time I heard it. Not just what the business was, what she'd charge for it, which month she intended to leave her job by, what her bank account needed to say before she'd allow herself to do it. She wasn't reciting a dream. She was reading something closer to a set of instructions she'd already given herself, weeks earlier, somewhere I hadn't been present for. I didn't think much of it at the time. It just sounded like she was further along in her thinking, that's all. A detail I filed away and forgot about for years. It came back to me later, when I started reading through what Napoleon Hill actually spent 2 decades doing before he ever wrote a word about wealth. He wasn't guessing at any of this from a desk. He was commissioned, early in the last century, to study several hundred of the most successful people in America, industrialists, inventors, financiers, trying to find whatever it was they had in common underneath all their obvious differences in background, education, and luck. And one detail from that research kept surfacing quietly in account after account, in a way that had nothing to do with strategy or capital. It showed up in how these people had described what they wanted long before they had it. Not the way most people describe a wish. The way you describe something you already fully expected to be holding. I want you to sit with that distinction for a second, because I think it's easy to skim past it as if it's obvious. It isn't obvious. Almost everyone wants more money. Almost everyone, at some point, has said the words "I want to be successful" and meant them completely in that moment. Wanting isn't rare. What I found sitting underneath the story of the woman who actually built her business and underneath account after account in Hill's own research was something else entirely, something most people never do, not because it's difficult, but because nobody ever told them it was the part that actually mattered. I'm going to tell you exactly what that something is. But first, I need to tell you about the sentence she said to me the day she quit her job. 5 words, spoken so plainly, I almost missed how much weight they were carrying. She told me later, almost as an afterthought, that she'd said the same 5 words to herself in the mirror the morning she handed in her notice. There's no plan B here. Not because she was reckless. She wasn't a reckless person. If anything, she was the more cautious of the 2 people I've been telling you about, the type who read the fine print, who kept a spreadsheet of her expenses down to the dollar. What she'd actually done, weeks before that morning, was quietly remove the exact thing most of us assume we need in order to feel safe enough to begin. The soft, comfortable exit sitting in the back of the mind, the option to just go back to normal if this doesn't work out. Here's what I didn't understand until much later. That exit isn't neutral. It doesn't just sit there, harmless, waiting in case you need it. It actively competes for your attention every single day you keep it open, quietly making the difficult thing in front of you look a little less urgent than it actually is, because some part of your mind always knows there's a softer place to land if you stop trying. The coworker I mentioned earlier, the one still having the same conversation a decade later, never once removed his exit. He didn't need to work up the courage to fail, because failing was never really on the table. He'd built himself a life with no version of it where the business had to work, which meant, quietly, it never really had to start either. I think about a phrase I heard once, used almost in passing, describing exactly this kind of moment, the point where a person stops preparing to decide and simply decides, closing every door behind them except the one they intend to walk through. It sounds dramatic when you say it that way. In her case, it wasn't dramatic at all. It was a short, almost boring conversation with her manager on a Tuesday morning and a 2-week notice period that felt, she told me, less like courage and more like relief. The relief of finally not having 2 directions pulling at her at once. There's something researchers who study goal-directed behavior have documented that lines up with this almost exactly, and it has nothing to do with willpower. A goal that still has a comfortable retreat attached to it gets processed by the mind very differently than one that doesn't. When the alternative is still available, your brain treats the whole situation as reversible, low stakes, something to keep evaluating rather than executing. The moment a real alternative disappears, genuinely disappears, not just gets talked about as risky, something shifts in how urgently a person behaves. Not because the goal became more important, because it became the only option left standing. I want to be careful here, because I'm not telling you to burn down your life by Friday to prove a point. That's not what she did, and it's not what any of the people I eventually studied more closely had done either. What she'd actually removed wasn't her safety net in some financial sense. She still had savings, she still had a support system, people who would have helped her if things went badly wrong. What she'd removed was something quieter and, in a strange way, more important. She'd removed her own permission to quietly downgrade the goal the first time it got hard. She'd made it so that going back to how things were wasn't simply inconvenient. It was, in her own mind, no longer an option worth considering at all. That's the piece I kept turning over for weeks after our conversation, long before I ever opened one of Napoleon Hill's books and found, almost word for word, the exact same idea sitting in research conducted nearly a century earlier about people who'd never met her, in industries that no longer exist, living lives that looked nothing like hers on the surface. Because underneath the 5 words she said in that mirror, there was something more specific than simple commitment. Something with an actual shape to it. A detail I almost missed the first time she described it to me, and one I think you're going to recognize the second I say it out loud. Here's the detail I almost missed. It wasn't only that she'd decided. Plenty of people decide something in a burst of frustration on a bad Sunday night and forget they ever said it out loud by Wednesday. What she'd actually done was give the decision a shape specific enough that it could be checked. She knew the exact number her business needed to bring in by a specific month. She knew what she'd do, precisely, if that number wasn't there by then. Not a vague sense of reevaluating, but an actual next step already chosen in advance. When I asked her, almost as a test, what her goal for the first year was, she didn't pause. She gave me a figure, a date, a sentence describing what she'd be doing differently on the other side of it. It came out of her the way you'd recite your own address. Not something she was inventing on the spot for my benefit, but something she'd clearly said to herself, in that exact form, many times before that afternoon. Compare that to the coworker. Ask him the same question and you'd get warmth, sincerity, real feeling behind the words, and nothing underneath any of it you could actually measure. Someday, eventually, when the timing's right. Those aren't lesser versions of a goal. They're not goals at all, not in any form the mind can actually act on. They're closer to a mood, dressed up in the language of ambition, and moods, however sincere in the moment, don't tend to survive contact with a hard Tuesday. There's something almost unfair about how much this one distinction seems to matter, and I want to be honest about how counterintuitive it felt to me at first. You'd think a bigger, bolder dream would be the more motivating one, the grand vision, the sweeping ambition, the kind of goal that sounds impressive when you say it out loud at a dinner party. What the research on goal-directed behavior actually shows is closer to the opposite. A vague goal, no matter how large or how sincerely felt, gives the mind almost nothing to organize itself around. It can't be broken into steps because it was never specific enough to have steps in the first place. A goal with an actual number, an actual date, an actual next action attached to it does something a vague dream simply can't. It gives your attention somewhere concrete to land, every single day, instead of drifting toward whatever feels most urgent in the moment, which is almost never the thing that matters most in the long run. This is where Hill's research starts to feel less like history and more like something happening in your own kitchen right now, tonight, whether you've named it yet or not. Because the people he studied hadn't simply wished for wealth harder than everyone else. They'd done something closer to what she did the morning she gave her notice. They'd taken a wish and forced it to become specific, measurable, dated, real enough to fail at, which is the only kind of goal that was ever actually capable of succeeding. I think there's a sentence sitting in you right now, one you've probably said in some form more than once. I want to be financially free. I want a different life. I want more than this. I'm not asking you to doubt that it's sincere. I'm asking you to notice, honestly, whether it has ever had a shape, a number, a date, a next step you could describe to a stranger the way she described hers to me, without hesitating. If some part of you already knows the answer to that, and you're ready to stop letting that sentence stay soft and start giving it an edge, type "I am ready" in the comments right now. Not as a slogan you're borrowing, as the first sentence in a decision you're about to start giving actual shape to, in front of people who'll see it, in a moment you didn't have to make public, but chose to anyway. I read every one of them, and the version of you who writes that today is already standing closer to the door than the version who keeps scrolling, telling yourself someday, one more time. Here's something that took me a long time to admit to myself, because it isn't a comfortable thing to sit with. Staying vague isn't an accident. It's a strategy, an unconscious one, but a strategy all the same. As long as your goal never gets a number attached to it, you can never technically fail at it either. Someday, I'll be financially free can't be disproven. It can only keep getting postponed, quietly, forever, without ever once feeling like a broken promise. because a promise with no shape can't really be broken. It just fades a little more each year until it stops being mentioned at all. Give that same wish a number and a date, and suddenly it can be measured. Suddenly there's a version of next December where you either hit it or you don't, in front of yourself, with nowhere left to hide from the answer. That's not a small difference. That's the entire reason so few people ever do it. It isn't that writing down an exact figure is difficult. It takes less than a minute. A pen and a piece of paper is the whole requirement. It's that doing it exposes you to a very specific, very personal kind of disappointment. The kind vague wanting was quietly protecting you from the whole time. There's a line from Seneca, written almost 2,000 years before any of this, that I think about more than it probably deserves. If one does not know to which port one is sailing, no wind is favorable. I used to read that as a nice sentence about ambition. I read it differently now. A ship without a destination isn't simply slower. It can't actually be helped by anything. Not a favorable current, not a strong wind at its back, not a skilled crew. Every single advantage that comes its way is wasted because there's no port to measure it against, no way to tell whether today's wind is carrying you closer to anything at all. I think about the coworker again here because I watched this happen to him almost literally. Genuine opportunities came his way over those 10 years. A connection who could have opened a real door, a moment when a small amount of capital was actually available to him. He described both of these to me himself, in passing, the way you'd mention something that simply hadn't panned out. What actually happened, I think, is that neither opportunity had anywhere to land. He had no port. The wind blew directly past him, twice, because there was no destination for it to be useful toward. The woman who quit her job noticed things during that same period that, I'm convinced, had been sitting in plain sight the whole time, available to anyone who happened to be paying attention. A supplier willing to negotiate terms she wouldn't have thought to ask for. A conversation at a friend's dinner party that turned into her first serious client. None of that was luck arriving specifically for her. It was ordinary opportunity, the kind that passes almost everyone at roughly the same rate. Except her attention had a specific shape to search for, and his didn't. Researchers who study attention have found something close to this without needing any of the philosophy to back it up. Once a goal becomes specific enough, the mind starts filtering the ordinary noise of daily life differently, flagging as relevant 100 small details it would otherwise have let pass unnoticed entirely, not because those details are new, but because there's finally somewhere for them to go. I told you at the start of this video that there's a single, unglamorous act sitting underneath every one of these stories. Hers, the 500 people Hill spent 2 decades studying, and one more I haven't told you yet, the one that changes the shape of everything I've said so far. It doesn't start with a millionaire at all. It starts with a man standing outside a laboratory with almost nothing to his name, refusing to leave. His name was Edwin Barnes, and the year he showed up at Thomas Edison's laboratory, he had almost nothing. No money worth mentioning. No formal training in electricity or engineering. No connections that could get him past the front door on reputation alone. What he had, according to Edison's own later account of the meeting, was a way of standing there that made it hard to send him away. The look of a man who had already decided something the rest of the room hadn't caught up to yet. He didn't ask Edison for a job. That's the detail almost everyone gets wrong when they retell this story, and it's the detail that actually matters. He told Edison he'd come to go into business with him. Not for him. With him. A tramp, by Edison's own description, freshly arrived with no visible way of backing up a claim that audacious. And yet he said it plainly, as a fact about the future rather than a request for permission. Edison gave him work sweeping the laboratory floor. Not partnership, not even close to it. A menial job, the kind of position that would have insulted the ambition Barnes claimed to be carrying if he'd let it. He didn't quit. He didn't quietly lower his sights to something more realistic, the way almost anyone in his position would eventually have talked themselves into doing. He kept sweeping that floor for months, and by most accounts, years, waiting for one specific kind of opportunity and refusing every other kind of opportunity that might have pulled him toward an easier, more comfortable version of his life instead. That's the part worth sitting with. He wasn't simply patient. Patience alone explains very little here. What kept him at that laboratory, sweeping floors long after most people would have taken a better-paying job somewhere else, was that he had never given himself the other option in the first place. Somewhere before he ever walked through that door, Barnes had made his goal specific enough that almost nothing else could satisfy it. Not a good job, not a decent living, partnership with Edison, specifically, or nothing. He'd removed his own exits the same way the woman I told you about removed hers, decades before she was even born, in a building neither of them would ever visit at the same time. The opportunity finally arrived wearing an unglamorous disguise. Edison's team had developed a dictating machine, and the salesmen inside the company weren't especially excited about pushing it. It wasn't the invention anyone wanted to be remembered for. Barnes saw what almost nobody else in that building was willing to look at directly. He asked for the chance to distribute it. He got it. And what followed wasn't a modest improvement to his situation. It became the foundation of an actual partnership with the man he'd walked in claiming, with no evidence at all, that he was going to work alongside. Here, finally, is the single act underneath everything I've shown you tonight. The sentence Hill kept finding, in different words, across hundreds of interviews with people who had nothing obviously in common except this. At some specific point, each of them stopped merely wanting something and gave that want an exact shape. A precise objective, a date by which they intended to have it, a plan, however incomplete, that they began acting on immediately instead of waiting to perfect. And this is the part almost everyone skips. They wrote it down in a plain, specific sentence and returned to that sentence daily, out loud, until it stopped sounding like a hope and started sounding like a fact they were simply waiting to become true. Hill called the raw material behind it a burning desire, to separate it clearly from ordinary wanting, the kind of want most of us carry around comfortably for years without it ever costing us anything or demanding anything back. What Barnes carried into that laboratory wasn't comfortable. It had a shape sharp enough to keep him sweeping a floor for years on a bet almost nobody else would have taken twice. I promised you at the beginning of this video that this single act costs nothing and takes less time than reading a sentence. That's true, and I'm going to show you exactly how to do it before we're done tonight. But I need to tell you first why so many people hear a story like this one and still walk away and do absolutely nothing with it. Because I did exactly that myself, for longer than I'm comfortable admitting. I heard a version of the Barnes story for the first time years before I ever thought about interviewing anyone for a living, and I remember exactly how I reacted to it. I nodded. I thought, that's a good one, and I moved on with my week, the way you'd file away a documentary you enjoyed but never think about again. I didn't write anything down. I didn't ask myself what my own version of sweeping that floor might look like. The story asked nothing of me, because I never let it. That's the part almost nobody talks about honestly. Hearing this doesn't change anything by itself. You could know every sentence I've said to you tonight, word for word, and still walk away from this video and do exactly what you were already doing tomorrow morning. I know that, because it's precisely what I did, for longer than I'm comfortable telling you about yet. Here's the reason, as far as I've been able to work it out. Writing a specific number down, with a specific date attached, does something a vague hope never has to do. It puts your own name on a claim that can be checked. As long as the goal stays soft, unformed, described only in feeling. I want to build something. I want more freedom. I want things to be different. You can never really be wrong about it. It just sits there, technically still true, technically still possible, forever. The moment you write an exact figure and an exact date, you've created a small, private contract with yourself that has an actual deadline. And some part of you, quietly, knows that a deadline you set yourself is also a deadline you might miss, in a way you'll have to look directly at, in your own handwriting, with nobody else to blame for the outcome. I think that's the real reason so few people ever do this, and it has nothing to do with laziness. It's closer to something almost protective. Staying vague feels safer, in the same crooked way that never stepping on a scale feels safer than facing a number you're afraid of. The scale doesn't create the weight. It only makes you look directly at what was already true. A written, dated, specific goal works the same way on a dream. It doesn't create the risk of failing. It only removes your ability to pretend, comfortably, that you haven't already been failing at something you never let yourself name in the first place. I watched this play out in a woman I spoke with much later, in an entirely different context, who told me she'd tried something close to this exercise once, years earlier, and quit after a single afternoon. She'd sat down to write her goal the way a friend had described it to her, an exact number, an exact date, and found herself, pen in hand, unable to finish the sentence. Not because she didn't know what she wanted, because writing the actual number made the size of the gap between where she stood and where she wanted to be suddenly, uncomfortably real, in a way that simply thinking about it never had. She put the pen down. She told herself she'd come back to it later, once she'd thought it through a little more. She didn't come back to it for 3 more years. Here's the part one find myself thinking about more than almost anything else in this whole story. The discomfort she felt that afternoon wasn't a sign she was doing it wrong. It was a sign she was doing it exactly right. The exercise working precisely as it's supposed to, for the very first time, showing her something true that vague wanting had been quietly hiding from her for years. Most people mistake that discomfort for evidence the plan is flawed, or the timing is wrong, or they're simply not ready yet. It isn't any of those things. It's just the sound of a wish finally being asked to become real, and real things, almost always, cost something to look at directly. I want to be honest with you about a question that's probably sitting somewhere behind all of this, because I'd be asking it myself if I were on your side of the screen right now. Isn't this a little too simple? A pen, a piece of paper, a number, and a date. Is that really the entire distance between the life you have and the one you keep saying you want? No. Writing a number on a piece of paper doesn't build a business, doesn't pay a mortgage, doesn't replace the years of unglamorous work almost everyone in this story still had to do afterward. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think it would be dishonest to let you believe otherwise. Barnes still swept that floor for years. The woman who quit her job still worked harder in her first 18 months of running her own business than she ever had working for someone else. Writing the sentence isn't the whole journey. It's the part almost nobody bothers to do before starting the journey at all, which means most people spend years walking in no particular direction, wondering why the walking itself never seems to add up to anything. Here's what I think actually happens when something sounds this simple. We assume simple must mean small, that anything worth having has to come wrapped in complexity, in strategy, in some system too sophisticated for an ordinary evening at a kitchen table. I understand the instinct. I've felt it myself, more than once, dismissing something precisely because it didn't ask enough of me on the surface. But simple and easy aren't the same word, even though we tend to treat them like they are. Writing one honest, specific sentence about exactly what you want and returning to it daily until you believe it is simple to describe and, as you heard a moment ago, genuinely difficult to actually sit down and do. The difficulty was never in the mechanics. It was always in what the mechanics force you to face. I also want to address something else, because I think it would be unfair of me not to. Not everyone reading a sentence like this is starting from the same place. Some of you are carrying responsibilities that make an 18-month runway of hard, uncertain work feel impossible right now. Kids depending on you, a health situation that limits your hours, no savings cushion to fall back on if a plan doesn't work on schedule. I'm not going to pretend those circumstances don't matter or that a piece of paper erases them. They're real, and they shape what's actually possible for you this year in ways that have nothing to do with how clearly you've defined your goal. Here's what I can tell you honestly, without minimizing any of that. Definiteness is one of the only parts of this entire story that isn't gated by circumstance. It doesn't cost money. It doesn't require permission from anyone. A person with almost nothing can write an exact number and an exact date with exactly the same pen as a person with every advantage in the world. What differs between them isn't whether they're allowed to do it. It's whether they've ever been told it matters enough to bother. Researchers who study goal setting have documented something that lines up with all of this in a way that has nothing to do with motivation posters or willpower. Specific, measurable goals consistently outperform vague ones across almost every domain studied, not by a small margin, but dramatically, and the effect holds regardless of how difficult the goal actually is. A hard, specific goal reliably produces more focused effort than an easy, vague one, because the vague goal never gives the mind anything concrete to organize its attention around in the first place. It isn't that specificity makes the work easier. It's that specificity is the only thing that makes the work aimable at all. I keep coming back to something in that finding that I think most people miss entirely. It isn't the size of the goal that determines how hard you'll work toward it. It's whether the goal has an edge sharp enough to actually cut through everything else competing for your attention on an ordinary Tuesday. The errands, the tiredness, the 100 smaller urgencies that will always feel more pressing in the moment than a distant number on a page you wrote once and haven't looked at since. Which brings me to the piece of paper I wrote myself on a night I still remember with more discomfort than I expected to feel telling you about it now. I'd heard the barn story probably a dozen times before I ever tried writing anything down myself, and even then, it wasn't because I suddenly believed in it. It was because I was tired, in the specific, quiet way you get tired after doing the same halfway effort for long enough to know, somewhere underneath your own denial, that it isn't working. I was sitting on the floor of an apartment I could only barely afford that month, notebook open on my knees, trying to write down what I actually wanted from the work I was doing on the side, late at night, after a job that had nothing to do with any of it. I wrote the first sentence easily enough. I want this to actually work someday. And then I sat there, pen against the page, completely unable to write anything more specific than that. I want to be honest about why, because I think it's the same reason that woman put her pen down 3 years before she ever picked it back up. Writing a real number felt like inviting a very specific kind of failure into the room, one I could no longer explain away afterward as bad timing or bad luck. As long as the goal stayed soft, someday, eventually, when things line up, I got to keep believing in it without ever being tested by it. The blank space after that first sentence sat there for what felt like a long time. Longer than it probably actually was. I finally wrote something, and it wasn't impressive. It wasn't even particularly ambitious, looking back on it now. A number of people I wanted this work to genuinely reach by a date roughly a year out, and one sentence underneath it describing, as plainly as I could manage, what I'd be doing differently once it happened. I remember feeling almost embarrassed by how small and specific it looked on the page, compared to the vague, sweeping version of the dream I'd been carrying around in my head for months, the one that always sounded so much more impressive out loud than it ever did written down in exact terms. That discomfort didn't go away once I closed the notebook. I read that sentence back the next morning and felt a version of the same resistance all over again. A small, insistent voice suggesting I'd been too hasty, that I should soften the number, push the date back, give myself more room in case something went wrong. I understand now that voice wasn't wisdom. It was the same old habit of staying comfortable, wearing the costume of caution, showing up right on schedule the moment the goal became something that could actually be checked. I read it anyway, out loud, quietly, so nobody in the apartment next door would hear me and think I'd lost my mind. A grown man reading a single sentence to himself in an empty room like it meant something. It felt strange the first few times. It felt less strange by the second week, mostly because I stopped waiting for it to feel profound and started treating it as something closer to routine, the same way you check a compass without expecting the compass itself to move you anywhere. It only had to keep pointing. I won't tell you the number I hit by that date, because that's not really the part that matters here, and I don't think it would mean much to you without the year of ordinary, undocumented effort standing behind it. What I can tell you is smaller and, I think, more useful. Once that sentence existed, written down, dated, specific enough to be wrong about, something in how I spent my evenings changed almost immediately before there was a shred of outside evidence that any of it was working. I stopped drifting through the extra hour after dinner. I started asking a very particular question of almost everything competing for my attention. Does this move me toward the sentence on that page, or away from it? Most things, it turned out, had been quietly pulling me away from it for a long time, and I'd simply never had anything specific enough to measure them against before. If you're sitting somewhere right now with your own version of that blank space after the first sentence, I want this to work. I want things to be different. I want more than this. I'm not going to tell you the rest writes itself once you push through it. It doesn't. What I can tell you is exactly how to write the rest of it, in a form specific enough to actually hold weight, starting tonight, in less time than it's taken you to watch this video so far. Start with the object itself, because this is where almost everyone's version of it stays too soft to actually work. Not I want to be financially free. An amount. A specific role, a specific kind of income, a number you could say out loud to a stranger without flinching. It doesn't need to be enormous. It needs to be exact enough that a year from now, you'll be able to look at it and say, plainly, whether you got there or not. Vague goals are comfortable precisely because they can never be checked. You're removing that comfort on purpose, because comfort is exactly what's been keeping the goals soft enough to ignore. Next comes the part almost every version of this advice leaves out entirely, and it's the part Hill was insistent on. Decide what you intend to give in exchange for it. Not hope for it, not deserve it, exchange for it. Wealth in any form doesn't arrive as payment for wanting something badly enough. It arrives as payment for something specific you're willing to offer the world in return, whether that's a skill, a service, hours of unglamorous effort, or some combination of all three. Barnes didn't offer Edison ambition. He offered years of work nobody else wanted to do, positioned exactly where the opportunity would eventually appear. Decide now what your version of that floor sweeping actually looks like, because it's rarely glamorous, and it's almost never what you'd choose if comfort were the only consideration. Then set the date. Not someday, an actual month, an actual year. This is the part that will feel the most exposed, the same discomfort the woman felt with her pen frozen above the page, the same resistance I felt rereading my own sentence the next morning, wanting to push it back a little further just to feel safer. Set it anyway. A goal with no deadline isn't a goal. It's a wish wearing a goal's clothing, and your mind can tell the difference even when you can't. After the date comes the plan, and here's where I need to be direct with you, because this is where most people quietly stall out even after doing everything else correctly. You are not required to have a complete, flawless plan before you begin. Nobody in this entire story had one. Barnes had no idea, standing in that laboratory with a broom in his hand, that a dictating machine would eventually be the door he walked through. What he had was a direction and a willingness to start moving in it immediately, adjusting the plan as better information arrived, rather than waiting for certainty that was never going to show up before he started. Begin with whatever plan you have today, incomplete as it is, and correct it as you go. Waiting for the perfect plan is just the old habit of staying safely undecided, wearing a more sophisticated disguise. Now write it down. One sentence. The object, the date, the first action you're going to take. Not a paragraph, not a vision board covered in images cut out of magazines. One clear, specific sentence you could hand to a stranger and have them understand exactly what you intend to accomplish and by when. and then read it. Twice a day, out loud, quietly if you need to, in a moment that already exists in your routine, so the habit has somewhere to attach itself. The same few minutes after you wake up, the same few minutes before you turn off the light at night. Not as a performance, not hoping the words alone will move anything. You're doing exactly what Hill described doing with a written statement of desire, and what modern research on attention confirms happens as a direct result, training your own mind to notice, throughout an ordinary day, whatever happens to be relevant to that sentence, instead of letting it pass by unnoticed the way it would have a month ago. Last, and this is the part almost nobody wants to hear, remove the soft exit. You don't need to burn down your entire life to do this. You need to stop quietly reserving the option to abandon the goal the moment it gets uncomfortable. Decide, in advance, on a calm day, that going back to exactly how things are now is no longer the plan, whatever else happens along the way. I told you a story about Barnes reaching Edison's laboratory. I never told you what happened to him in the years between the broom and the deal that finally made him wealthy, the part where almost everyone would have quit, and he very nearly did too. The story goes that the years in between were not easy ones, and Barnes never pretended otherwise when he told it later in life. He watched other men who'd started around the same time as him get moved into better positions, real titles, steady raises, the kind of visible progress that makes a person look, from the outside, like they're clearly doing something right. He was still sweeping floors and running errands, a position that hadn't meaningfully changed in years, while people who'd made smaller, safer goals for themselves kept passing him by in every way you could measure from the outside. I think about that period more than I think about the ending, honestly, because it's the part almost nobody wants to sit inside of for very long when they tell this story. There must have been evenings where the safer path looked genuinely reasonable. Take the promotion being offered elsewhere, accept the decent, unremarkable job a friend had suggested might be a better fit. Quietly let the goal of partnership soften into something more realistic, the way almost everyone eventually softens a goal that isn't producing visible results fast enough. Nobody would have blamed him. It would have looked, from any reasonable outside perspective, like maturing, like finally being sensible. He didn't take it. And here's the part one think actually explains why, more than any claim about sheer stubbornness or unusual willpower. He hadn't left himself a version of the goal soft enough to quietly downgrade. He hadn't decided he wanted a good career in Edison's general orbit, something adjustable, something that could flex into whatever position eventually opened up. He'd decided, specifically, on partnership, on a level of collaboration with Edison himself, and that specificity was exactly what made every other opportunity along the way look like what it actually was to him, a detour, not a destination. A vaguer goal would have let him rationalize the detour as a rival. His goal was too precisely shaped to let him lie to himself that easily. When the dictating machine finally appeared, and Edison's own sales team treated it as an afterthought nobody was eager to push, Barnes didn't need to deliberate. He'd already spent years positioned exactly there, waiting for a door shaped roughly like this one, even though he couldn't have described its exact shape in advance. That's a detail worth sitting with on its own. He never knew, walking in that first day with a broom in his hand, that it would specifically be a dictating machine. He only knew, with total clarity, what kind of door he intended to walk through the moment it appeared. The specificity was never really about predicting the future. It was about being ready to recognize the door the instant it showed up, instead of needing weeks to convince himself it was real. He asked for the distribution rights. He got them, and the partnership he'd claimed, with no evidence at all, standing in that laboratory years earlier as a man with nothing to his name, finally became the plain, unremarkable truth everyone else could now see too. I think about how many of those years must have felt, from the inside, like a mistake. How many mornings he must have swept that same floor wondering whether the other men, the ones with their steady raises and their visible progress, had actually been the sensible ones all along. And he was the one quietly wasting the best years he had on a fantasy that was never going to arrive. He couldn't have known, on any single one of those mornings, how close the door actually was. Nobody standing inside their own version of that waiting ever can. Somewhere in your life right now, there's probably a floor you've been sweeping for longer than you expected to, wondering whether you've simply been foolish this whole time. I don't know how many years are left in your version of that story, and neither do you. And I think that uncertainty is exactly what makes the goal you write down tonight matter more than it would if the timeline were guaranteed. You're not writing it because you know when the door appears. You're writing it so you'll recognize it, clearly, specifically, the moment it finally does. I never told you the co-worker's name, and there's a reason for that. It isn't because I wanted to protect him. It's because I think, if you're honest with yourself for a moment, you already know several people who could wear it. Maybe you've worn it yourself, for a season, without ever quite admitting that's what was happening. As far as I know, he's still saying some version of the same sentence tonight. Somewhere, to someone patient enough to listen, I really need to get serious about this. Warm words. Sincere, even. Still with no shape to them at all. The woman who quit her job with 5 words in the mirror is still running the business she gave herself permission to name, out loud, before there was a single piece of evidence it would work. Barnes got his partnership years after most people would have quietly let the goal soften into something safer. I still read a version of the sentence I wrote on that apartment floor, though the number has changed more than once since then, revised upward each time the old one stopped being big enough to hold what I actually wanted. None of these are different kinds of people. That's the part one most want to leave you with, more than any single piece of advice from tonight. Nothing separates the 4 of us from you, or from the co-workers still circling the same conversation, except one short, specific, almost boring act, the willingness to take a soft want and force it to become exact enough that it could actually be measured, missed, or met. Napoleon Hill spent the later years of his life insisting that wealth was never only the number sitting in an account, and I understand that sentence differently now than I did the first time I encountered it. I used to think it was a consolation prize for people who never got rich, a nice thing to say to make the money not matter so much. I think it means something narrower now, and more exact. The number in the account was never really the point of the exercise. It was only ever proof, arriving late, of something that had already happened much earlier, quietly, on an ordinary evening, at a kitchen table, or an apartment floor, or a laboratory nobody important was watching. The moment a wish stopped being soft enough to hide inside, and became something specific enough to actually chase. You have a version of that moment waiting for you tonight, whether or not you feel ready for it. I don't know your exact number. I don't know your date, or your plan, or what you're willing to exchange for any of it. Only you know that, and if you're honest, some part of you has known it for longer than you've been willing to admit out loud. There's a pen somewhere in your house right now. There's a blank page, or a blank note on the same phone you're holding this video on. The distance between where you are and the life you keep describing in soft, comfortable language was never as far as it felt. It was only ever as far as the nearest piece of paper and the willingness to write something down that could actually be wrong. Seneca said no wind favors a ship with no port in mind. I think about that line differently now too. It was never a warning about ambition. It was a description of what happens to a life that never gets specific enough to be steered. How much good wind simply passes through it, and used, because there was nowhere for it to take you. Somewhere tonight, someone is writing their number down for the first time. Somewhere else, someone just like them is closing the notebook, telling themselves they'll come back to it later. Neither one will know, for years, which decision that turned out to be. If tonight is the night your own sentence finally gets written, follow this channel before you go, because there's more of this waiting for the evenings you need it again. And if you know 5 people still circling the same soft, comfortable version of their want, send this to them tonight. One of them might finally pick up the pen because you did.